Right, if anybody's out there, I'm getting ready. And I see we have comments coming in already. Hello, welcome. We'll be starting at 2 o'clock. Let me have a read of what you've written. Very good. Hope you all have coffee. And for those of you who are listening, I hope you can hear in the background we have the music of Henry Purcell, which is of the period of our first writer. And what you're hearing is Purcell's airs for the theatre, which I thought was pretty appropriate. Purcell was probably the most popular composer of the time. Bach was envious of him, envious of his popularity. Bach was better, though. You see, we have a lot of old PICT friends signing up and people I haven't seen for an age. So you've got a lot of people starting to sign up now, and so let me say hi. Paula, how nice to see you, and I hope Art is doing good. And I see Steve and Michael are there. Thank you, Steve and Michael, out in the wilds of the north side, of the northern region of our city. Joan in Washington. It's nice that we're reaching out that far. In fact, we're reaching a lot further because I have a suspicion we're reaching as far as Ireland and various other places as well. Although I know I have a son in Australia, but I suspect he's asleep now, it being the middle of the night there. We're flooding in now. Art, good to see you there, and you're most welcome. For those just joining, I was saying the music in the background, which will disappear in a while, is the music of Henry Purcell, who would have been the, one might describe, the hot composer of the period of our writer for today. And the music you're hearing is his airs for the theatre, which I thought reasonably appropriate, given what we're up to. Somebody round the corner from me, Christine in Regent Square. Welcome. I suspect you, by the look of it, know infinitely more about the topic than I do. But anyway, we'll struggle on. I hope everybody can hear clearly. Good to see you there, Tony. Joe, if you cannot hear, forgive the suggestion, but try turning up the volume. Dieguit Dave. It's nice to get a greeting on Gaeilge. Not that my Gaeilge is particularly good, but anyway. Well, there you are. Jim in San Francisco can hear me clearly, so everybody else should. Somebody else in Magda in San Antonio. Hello there, welcome. Okay. I love Baroque music. It's almost like jazz. I love it. Especially Bach. Well, the volume seems to be okay on everybody's site. I'm presuming that the picture is as well. Of course, that depends on the quality of your screen, but mine looks good. Thank you, Steve, for the compliment. I'm not going to tell everybody else what the compliment was. Okay, so we're now at 2 o'clock or just after, so we're going to begin. And I think I'll begin by taking Mr. Purcell down to a much lower level. Might leave him a little bit in the background, but you may not hear him. So, welcome. Welcome to PICT Educates. I don't want to sound pompous about that. This is not, to begin with, a history lesson. It's not an academic study. It's not particularly authoritative. What it is having a chat about a particular topic dear to my heart. People often ask me, why the Irish in PICT, Irish and Classic, in the PICT name? And it's not simply because I'm Irish or particularly about individual plays. What it's about is influence. We present classic theatre, and to me, a classic play is a play that is fundamentally true of its time and for all time. And we tend to operate for plays in the English language or from the English language. And one of the points that I always like to make is that the English theatre, as we know it, after a certain point in history, became deeply affected and influenced by Irish playwrights. And we're going over the next 5 weeks, we're going to, this week and 4 more, we're going to look at 5 of those writers: George Farquhar, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, and Samuel Beckett. And the reason I picked those 5 is because I believe they've had a considerable influence on the development of English-speaking theatre, both in England, in Britain, and in America, and pretty much everywhere else in the world for some of them. Even Farquhar had an influence in that one of his plays was the very first to be presented in Australia. And I have a suspicion, I need confirmation on this, was also the first professional play to be presented on the North American continent in the first known custom-built theatre. But I'll come to that in a minute. So what we're doing with these sessions is a celebration of Irish writers and their influence on English-speaking theatre. First of all, I want to just lay down a few points. I'll be repeating this with every class or every session. You can see me, I cannot see you. It's terribly important we understand that, because if we could see you, you'd all have to sign release documents, and we can't see you. Only you can see me. But you can interact with me and with each other. You can use the chat reel that's probably to the left of your, to the right of your screen. If it's not there, you can go find it, but you can chat to me, you can chat to each other on that, just like Facebook Messenger or whatever. And the other way is you can actually use the Q&A screen as well. If you've got a longer question or something or a longer statement you want to make, use the Q&A rather than the chat. It's easier. So there's a third way. You can email me later, and that's important because when this session is finished, it's being recorded as we do it, and that means that you can have a link will be sent to you by email so that you can look at it again, or if you missed it, or if friends want to look at it, you can show it to them through that link. It'll be available as long as you want it, and so that's the three methods of contact. Use the chat, use the Q&A, or send us an email to PICT Theatre, and we will give you a response to whatever that question may be. Also, at the end of the session, there will be a trivia question, and whoever wins that trivia question, and you have to reply by email. Whoever is the first to get back to us with the answer to that trivia question will get 2 tickets for our next production, which hopefully will be in the fall. We all hope that we'll all be back together in the fall. I'll post that trivia question right at the end, but there will be a clue within what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I think I've covered everything there. So let's go back to our writer of the day. And the writer of the day is George Farquhar, F-A-R-Q-U-H-A-R. It sounds foreign. It's actually probably a corruption of a couple of Scottish names, because Farquhar was born in the city of Derry in Ireland, of Protestant persuasion, and that name is probably Scots-Irish as opposed to Irish-Irish. He, like so many others, and I'm going to have to keep consulting notes here, you have to forgive me. He was born in 1677. Now, as I say, it's not a history lesson, but I want to make a point about some things here. For instance, he was born 61 years after the death of Shakespeare. And to put that into context, around 61 years ago, the Beatles had their first #1 hit. So it's not that long ago. Farquhar came out of that whole resurgence of activity that followed the end of the Tudor period. The beginning, Shakespeare saw the end of the Tudors, he saw the beginning of the Stuarts, when James VI of Scotland became James I of England. And his company was elevated from the Lord Chamberlain's men to the King's men. The importance of theatre was established, that the king was the sponsor and the major supporter of theatre. His son Charles came to the throne. Charles had a row with Parliament. Parliament threw him out. Parliament executed him and established a commonwealth, or basically a republic. So there was a major civil war going on before Farquhar was born. In that period, they also continued, as they always did. The English have always been fighting the French. From the time of Henry, in fact earlier, from the time of the Norman conquest and even before that, the English and the French have always been fighting one another. So in that period, apart from the Civil War, there was also the French influence as well. The Beatles, as I say, were 60 odd years ago, not too far back in our history. So for Farquhar, an awareness of all the social and political events would have been part of his education. The restoration of Charles II changed the nature of society completely. During the period when Cromwell and Parliament and the Puritans controlled, all the theatres were closed. All the public houses, forms of public entertainment, all of that was completely shut down. And it's a bit like today, in fact, except it was Parliament and not a virus. But some people would have described Cromwell as a virus anyway, especially the Irish. So everything that had existed in terms of the joy of life, the great golden age of Elizabeth I, disappeared. After the Stuarts were sent from the throne, Cromwell came in with Parliament, everything shut down. Eventually, the English realized, no, we don't like this. So they brought back James's second son, Charles II. He came back because he'd been hiding out in Europe. He'd been hiding out, in fact, in France. But he brought with him, because he had a love of the arts, of music and of drama and everything, he brought with him a new kind of theatre. The old theatre of Shakespeare, we know about the Globe, you know, the theatre, almost thrust stage, based on the old concept of an inn with balconies. And he brought back something that had started in Italy to a large degree. It was the idea of a picture frame with moving scenery and actors telling out a story in front of the moving scenery within the picture frame. That picture frame became known as the proscenium arch. And a new style of staging was discovered, where you would have sometimes just flat scenery and sometimes moving scenery, and actors standing in front of it telling the story. The actors were almost in the Italian mode. The actors were almost secondary to the art, but then again, there's nothing new there. So this kind of theatre was brought back into the UK, or into, it was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and actors started to enjoy it. And so did actresses, because for the first time under Charles II, women were allowed to act on the stage. It had been forbidden prior to that. Anybody who's seen Shakespeare in Love knows that particular story. But women were allowed onto the stage. Charles wanted it. Nell Gwyn was, amongst other things, an actress. So women had the opportunity to walk onto a stage and entertain the public without being, or very often were being, described as members of the oldest profession. But it was now acceptable. So where did the plays come from? Well, once writers, poets were allowed to write again, write they most certainly did for the theatre, because it is an exciting form to write for. And you had a group of writers lauding and extolling and being amusing about, and the tendency was to be amusing. The tendency was for the joy of things, for the expression of the joy of life that really fitted into the Carolean, the Charles II period. Good King Charlie's golden days. They wanted an expression, an explosion of, I think, fun. So an awful lot of these plays operated that way, and many of them tended to be about aristocracy. But along in the latter part of this first explosion came this young man from Ireland, from Derry. He had, as I say, born in 1677. He initially, after his initial education, he went to Dublin. He went from Derry to Dublin, because you go to the capital, and he went to Trinity College, which was then in existence. It had been established by Elizabeth I, and he probably went to study to be a clergyman, because that's what you did. You took a doctorate in divinity and you became a clergyman. However, he was a classic example of the dropout, legendary dropout. He decided, for one reason or another, that being an actor would be far better than being a clergyman. Now, I personally would agree with that, but it's not a new novelty. People have had that thought for a very long time. Farquhar wanted to be an actor, and it happened that in Dublin, theatre did exist in a quality format. And the first known professional constructed theatre in Ireland, in Dublin, was the Smock Alley Theatre, which, if you go to Dublin, you can still visit, because they have re-established a theatre in the room in which the original Smock Alley existed. And he worked there. He worked with a guy called John Wicks, who, another actor, probably a lot better. Farquhar was never considered a great actor, but he enjoyed doing it. The audience liked him, even though he wasn't particularly good. But on one particular occasion in a play, he picked up in the wings the wrong sword. He was going on stage and he had to do a stage fight with another actor. But instead of picking up the bendy foil, he picked up something that was completely wrong, went into the fight and nearly killed the other actor. He wounded him so badly, the guy nearly died. So Farquhar, thinking that discretion was the better part of valor, moved to London. He got away as quickly as he could. And sorry, I'm getting questions coming in. I just want to, by the way, yes, so there's a question here about the Prince Charles, the King Charles. It was not Bonnie Prince Charlie. That was somebody else entirely much later on. King Charles II, the son of James I, brother of Charles, son of Charles I, was not Bonnie Prince Charlie. Different point. Anyway, I'm not doing a history lesson. Where was it? Yes. So he moved to London with his friend John Wicks, who had been invited to go and work at Drury Lane Theatre. There were two very famous theatres in London at the time, being Drury Lane and Covent Garden. Drury Lane will stay in English theatrical history for a very long time. Drury Lane was the theatre of Garrick. Drury Lane became the theatre of Farquhar. Drury Lane was eventually, next week's topic, was the theatre of Richard Brinsley Sheridan. And the present incarnation, which is about 20 times the size of the original, is currently owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber. So Drury Lane has been an integral part of London theatre for 300 years. The one that he went to was quite small. It's a small playhouse, probably seated 100 or 2 people, but and very intimate. But it was incredibly important. It was the place. It was like the, I suppose you might say, it was a place where the embryo of new English theatre, or new British theatre, I might say, began to grow. New playwrights, young actors, an excitement and a creativity. And into this came Farquhar, both as an actor, but as I say, he wasn't a very good actor. he mixed his life. He did take a commission and worked for a while as a soldier in the trade of recruiting. And as a soldier, because at the time England was yet again fighting another war with the French. This time it was the War of Spanish Succession. There's a different name for every one of those wars. After all, you're in Pittsburgh, we had English and French fighting one another in the 7 Years' War. They've never stopped fighting, and they never really liked one another. But Farquhar joined up and became a part-time, well, part soldier, part writer, began the process of writing, but he worked in the west of England in the art of recruiting. And recruiting for the army in those days was not like today. Recruiting for the army in those days was really quite, you might have heard of the naval recruits where men were pressed into, they were kidnapped, knocked out, got drunk, money dropped on them so it looked like they'd accepted the king's shilling. Same in the army in those days. Also, if somebody was up in front of the justice for petty crimes, the justice could say, you go and serve in the army. This was not a professional army. This was cannon fodder. And so officers would go around the country finding recruits, giving them a uniform, putting a musket in their hand, and sending them across the sea to France to die. Now, they had a good reputation, the English army at that point, because back in 1704, I think it was, there was a major victory at Blenheim by one John Churchill to become Lord Marlborough. And John Churchill, who was the ancestor of Winston Churchill, won this famous battle, and the whole process helped to prevent France and Spain becoming a unified nation, a unified force of Catholicism against the still very Protestant England. But anyway, Farquhar's part of that was to recruit troops, the cannon fodder, to go out. But he also began to write. And his early plays found success because they were slightly different, because there was something about them that wasn't the same as other Restoration writers. And to my mind, this is the important point and why I consider that Farquhar made a very vital contribution to the development of English theatre as we now understand it. There's a linear going on. Farquhar didn't write about aristocrats. If anything, he followed that Shakespeare mode to prove that anybody with rank and position was just the same as anybody else, except that their ancestors had carried a bigger sword. But he didn't write about aristocrats in the way that others did. He wrote about the middle class and the peasantry, which are much more interesting. Aristocrats can be very boring, whereas the middle class can be full of the most fascinating and wicked characters. He also discovered, I don't think he discovered it, but he developed something terribly important, that cruelty is funny. And when you examine his plays, you will find that comedy is to a large extent based on cruelty. One of the great truths in life is a thing in theatre, and it's something that I learned a very, very, very long time ago from my directing mentor, Hilton Edwards, who was founder of the Gate Theatre in Dublin, that we laugh at the sufferings of others. Things that people in pain are funny. Sounds a rotten thing to say, but it is absolutely true. And I remember Hilton giving the definition to me that a farce is a tragedy happening to somebody else. And the worse it is, the funnier it looks. Whereas a tragedy is a farce happening to you. That things seem to just get worse and worse and worse and worse, and we keep laughing at it. So cruelty is an essential part of what is funny. And cruelty is very often a trait in Irish writing, and the ironies that you get in Irish writing. But Farquhar seemed to have a finger on this particular pulse. Also, the fact that women could act, so he could use women in a way that earlier writers like Shakespeare, the Elizabethan writers, couldn't, because they had to use boys or young men. suddenly you could actually put women onto the stage. And that meant that you could deal much more blatantly with what is the major topic of all Restoration theatre, and I would maintain of an awful lot of theatre down that linear path, starting with the Restoration comedians, through Sheridan, through Wilde, through Noel Coward and Terence Rattigan, and into the modern day. And that one unifying fact, the one unifying topic, is sex. They could write about sex. Now, not blatant and not public and not overt. We're not talking pornography, although at the time it might have been thought as such. But we are talking about that wonderful, the kind of the line of conquest. The plays tend to be about the conquest of women by men. But because he's good, they were also about the conquest of men by women. And it's a kind of a warfare. It is the battle of the sexes that he tends to write about. And that battle is best exemplified, I think, in his play, The Recruiting Officer. To my mind, and there are several, I mean, the both Stratagem, Love and the Bottle, they're all about the attempt of a man to conquer a woman, of a man to win a woman. And all the way through these themes, there is the romantic theme, but there is also always a deep sexual undertone, because the object of the man is very often not merely to gather the woman in, possibly to marry, but certainly to bed. They want to bed the women. So you have a play set up in The Recruiting Officer that is a perfect example of this. You have a character, Captain Plume, who has returned to a small town in Shropshire where he has been before. He is recruiting. He's got this wonderful recruiting sergeant, PICT, who their basic function is to trick people into joining the army. But in this town, there was a girl he liked called Sylvia, and she is the daughter of the local justice, the local bigwig. He would be the local justice of the peace, basically. He would be the local magistrate. Again, it's middle class. It's not aristocracy. He wants Sylvia. Sylvia wants him. He doesn't want to admit he wants Sylvia because he's not ready to settle down yet. But along, in the meantime, comes an ordinary country girl called Rose. And Rose has beautiful chickens to sell. And Plume wants to buy her produce. But the chickens are a euphemism, totally a euphemism for her body. So part of that comedy is built on the seduction of the stupidity of the peasant girl. And they laugh at it. That's funny. That was funny. People who are uneducated become the victims of those with intellect. We laugh at them. Whether we should or not is beside the point. This is the reality of it. It's the way the plays were structured. And that thematic has continued, as I say, down this linear path all the way through. If you look at the plays of Noel Coward, they're all about sex. Every single one of them. It's about who sleeps with who gets married to who avoids sleeping with who. If you look at Present Laughter, one of his greatest achievements, the whole point is that the play begins with a young girl coming in to make a phone call because she spent the night with the leading character, with Gary Essendine. It was about sex. It's interesting that it is, I believe, out of the Irish imagination that this obsession became, as it were, purified. That plays began to take on this complete structure of the conquest of women by men and the conquest of men by women. Because the women are as wicked in their own way. The women will seduce in their own way. And the character of Sylvia in this particular play adopts an old but new tradition. Back in the time of Shakespeare, back in the Elizabethan period, women were not allowed to act. So men or boys would play women. When a boy who was a particularly good actor got just on the borderline of being acceptable as a girl, Shakespeare would often write a role where the boy playing the girl could disguise himself as a boy for the majority of the play and only turn into a girl again at the end. And so if you look at plays like As You Like It with Rosalind, if you look at Twelfth Night with Viola, you'll see a girl pretending to be a boy for most of the play, becoming a girl again at the end. So this tradition transmuted in this period into what we call the breeches role, where a woman can appear to be a man, can play a man. It's a kind of new tradition. And that again follows its own linear path through theatre from this period right almost to the present day. If any of you have ever seen a British panto, Christmas pantomime, or Irish for that matter, the tradition always was that the principal boy was played by a girl dressed as a boy. It's part of that tradition that comes down from Restoration Theatre. It's a very strong line of theatrical practice. But in this period, Farquhar decided to use it very cleverly. How do you get, and also there's another underlying factor in this as well, which is soldiers very often were not choosy as to the sex of who they slept with. So you will find that Plume in this particular play would rather lose a woman than lose a man. That men would sleep together. It's not a novel thing, and it's not even a particularly sexual thing. After all, Iago talks about that in Othello, when he says that he lay with Cassio, who threw his leg over his thigh and touched him and moaned on about Desdemona. There's a kind of a looseness in those relationships. But in this particular play, the device of women being conquered by men, men being conquered by women, uses all of these theatrical tricks, if you like. So we have this wonderful thing of the leading lady disguises herself as a man in order to prevent her lover, the man she loves, from sleeping with the peasant girl by claiming the peasant girl for herself. And because the soldier is so you see these wonderful complexities of absurdity beginning to build. Now, I have to consult my notes for a second. The point about that construct is that we see in it the very beginnings of an art form, of a theatrical art form, that hadn't truly existed prior to that, but now began to develop and purified itself in the late 19th century, mid-19th century, in a form of theatre called farce. The precept of farce is as I say, the creation of something that is potentially tragic, but viewed from the outside, we see its absurdities. We see the ridiculousness of it. Farquhar does that again in The Recruiting Officer by the creation of another recruiting officer. Plume is the leading character, but there is a second one called Brazen. And Brazen is what Brazen describes, a complete and absolute buffoon and liar, a brazen liar. He is also trying to woo, but he is so blatantly bad and so blatantly, stupidly honest. You know, he's looking for a woman with £20,000 a year. He's not looking for anything else except her money. He is an idiot. He is a fool. He claims to know everybody. He knows nobody. He claims to have a wonderful, heroic history. He's never actually shot a gun or used his sword in anger against anyone. These are the embryonic nature of characters that slowly build towards a farcical construct. And farce, although that word will not be used at this particular point, farce began its roots in that period. We start to see the absurdities of people's behavior. We look at the absurdities of the human condition and of human behavior, how stupidly people behave. You have in this play, for instance, the use of a fortune teller, which is in fact a recruiting sergeant in disguise, telling people's fortunes to lead them down a particular path he wants them to go down, to either mate with an appropriate man or sign up for the army or whatever. It's a device. And this kind of device, again, is part of that wonderful embryonic structure that leads us towards farcical characters. The trickery of the play, the trickery of the writing, is to convince the audience, to demonstrate to the audience their own absurdities. Just as all theatre does that, as Shakespeare put it, as Shakespeare said quite accurately, to hold as 'twere a mirror up to nature, for us to see ourselves through the behavior of characters in a play. But in this kind of thing, we are looking at ourselves, and we look through farce, which is a very, very serious form of theatre. We are looking at ourselves and our absurdities, the ways we behave, the things we will do to conquer women, to conquer men, the lies we will tell, the games we will play, the inappropriateness of our behavior. There's another factor in this. This was a time of war. This was a time when killing happened on a grand scale. And these wars were not like wars we understand today. These were the wars that culminated eventually in the Napoleonic. And sorry, we've just got a question there on that. I want to go back on that one. Did the pants rolls, the carryover from the opera tradition as well? The opera tradition, I think, and I'm not an authority on this, but the opera tradition came in parallel. Certainly, opera as we know it, if you go back as far as Monteverdi, the opera was following that same growth pattern that the proscenium arch gave. And in the early days, when you would have, for instance, falsetti and castrati singing the female roles and the male roles, if you look at you know, things like Orfeo, where Orpheus is sung by, would have been sung by a castrati, or now by a falsetti or a contratenor. That same tradition was, I suppose, happening in exactly the same way, because opera was simply another form of drama, and they were much closer, I think, related at that period than they are today. We tend to think of opera as something very separate. It isn't. It's theatre. It's performance. Mozart considered his operas to be plays that he would put music to. He'd have somebody else write a play, and he would write the music for it brilliantly. But so did Rodgers and Hammerstein considered their work. They wrote plays with songs. I think we've separated them out somewhat. Anyway, I'm off the point. Yes, I think that the breeches roles, the pants roles, did evolve in exactly that same parallel, but I stand to be corrected on that. So anyway, as I say, this structure of theatre, the potential, the ground rooting of farce, also brought something else, this notion that cruelty is funny. And when you look through his plays, there is savagery being discussed. For instance, in The Recruiting Officer, when they talk about what it's like to be a soldier and why you would want to be a soldier, so that you can go and smash a rifle butt into your musket butt into the head of a Frenchman and take his purse. It is about using buffoons and the innocent and the foolish in an incredibly cruel way, forcing men to sign up to go and fight. We find it is the comedy comes from the cruelty in which other people are treated by the major protagonists, how they treat each other, but also how they treat the peasantry. And the peasantry does not come off well. The peasantry will suffer. I think whether Farquhar intended it to be a satire or whether Farquhar just found it funny himself, I don't know, 300 years ago. But that aspect of the writing still today in the 21st century, 20 years into the 21st century, that today is still true. We still do find those things gloriously absurd. We will laugh at them. Whether we should or not, I believe we should. But I believe we should because we should look at our own absurdities. But I think Farquhar was one of the early writers to bring that into what we call the general scope of English theatre. There's an important point to make here, by the way. The four of the five writers we're going to talk about, the first four of them all moved to London and the fifth one to Paris. But why would they do that? It was the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland. James I had established the concept of Great Britain because by becoming, he was James VI of Scotland, he became James I of England, he united the two kingdoms. Wales was a principality of England. So he created a united kingdom of Great Britain. But he was also Lord of Ireland, technically. And so it became the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, one country. But because it was one country, there were three capitals. In fact, there were four if you include Wales, but nobody ever did include Wales. So Scotland had Edinburgh, which had been traditionally and for hundreds upon hundreds of years the capital of the nation of Scotland. Ireland had Dublin, the capital of the nation of Ireland. Not originally, but it was established as such by the Danes, not by the Irish. For the Irish, Tara was the capital, but once the Danes came, they created this town called Dublin. They built on this very muddy, marshy river, they built a bridge made of hurdles of woven wood, and that gave them something to get across the river. It was a ford over the river made of hurdles. So they called it, they called the town of the ford of the hurdles, which in the Irish was Ballyaclia, which is the official Irish name of the city. In fact, they settled there because there were tar pits quite nearby, which was created basically a black pool, which in the Irish is Dublin, which got corrupted to Dublin. So the Irish name of the city is from the Danish, whereas the English name of the city is from the Irish. Only in Ireland can this be true. But anyway, to get back to the point, these four writers gravitated to the capital. London was the capital. That was where it all happened. And that happens in every country, except in America, where the artists tend to gravitate towards New York or LA, although they should go to DC because it's a much nicer city. But in the United Kingdom, in Britain, if you had any hope of success, sooner or later, you went to London because that's where it was all happening. The famous amanuensis of Dr. Johnson, Boswell, who was a Scot from Edinburgh, knew that if he was going to have any success in life, he would have to move to London. And thank goodness he did, because we may not have known as much about Dr. Johnson without him. These writers knew instinctively the one thing that all artists really understand. If you are going to succeed, you must have an audience that appreciate the quality of the work you do. And for writers at that period, there was London. London was the center of the world for anybody in the United Kingdom. Not so much anymore, but at that point, you had to go there. You had to succeed there. That's where the best actors were. That's where the publishers were. That's where history had guided everybody from the time of the Roman invasion. Londinium was the center of the world. And each of these writers, as I said, the fifth one on our list actually went to Paris, but that was for a completely different reason. But each of these writers went to London because, apart from anything else, they knew that they would have an audience that was sophisticated and that would recognize what they were doing. And sophistication and recognition is a terribly important thing for all writers. Let me come back to this particular play, The Recruiting Officer. I'm going to, by the way, at the end of this whole series of talks, I'm going to give you a list of reading matter, a suggested reading list for each of the writers and which plays you should take a look at. I'm not going to do it now. I'm going to wait till we finish the whole thing. But as I say, because I'm not doing an academic analysis of the plays. I'm not doing a history lesson, although I've talked a lot of history today. It is simply to get you interested and hopefully intrigued by the writers that you may never have either witnessed or read or seen. So when you do get an opportunity to read these plays, look at not simply the plot line, but the construct, the way that they are written. Next week, when we talk about Sheridan, I'm going to be discussing one of his particular plays. But the way language is used and how much it had evolved. A lot of what Farquhar was doing, although it wasn't verse, still followed that rhythmic path that the Elizabethan writers had used. But his was much freer form and much closer to modern English in many ways, which it drifted away from, I believe, in the next period. But he also used very simple devices, and you'll find this always a lot in Restoration comedies. And we always have Restoration comedies like Jacobean tragedies. There were comedies in the Jacobean period, but it's the tragedies that crept to the surface because of the quality of that writing. Restoration comedies, we talk about the comedies. There were tragedies being written, but the comedies were the ones that really rose to the top because they exemplified the time. The writing included certain devices that, again, have come down through that linear path, one of which was the description of characters. So when you look at the plays, look at the names of the characters because they will describe to you an awful lot about the nature of the play and the nature of the character. You get an instant picture when the character walks on stage and says the name. You sort of know who they are, what they are. For instance, in The Recruiting Officer, the local, justice of the peace, the local magistrate is called Justice Balance. Now, the scales of justice. There, you've got it. The hero, full of panache, is called Plume. The absolute complete and fabricator of his own life, who will say anything to impress anyone, is called Brazen, the brazen liar. The beauty, the heroine, she who glitters with her own beauty, joy, and indeed passion and energy. She's one of the most wonderful characters written for a woman in that period. Is called Sylvia, Sylvan, silver, beauty. So you've got Kite, who'll fly up. He'll fly any lie to catch a recruit. The decent gentleman of the town is Mr. Worthy. So you see the way these characters, there's a play in a slightly later period that is a perfect example of it. The villain of which is the most loved character in the society in which the play is set, and his name is Maskwell. So writers didn't want the audiences to have to sit back and work things out. They wanted you to come in, sit at the play, know who everybody was, follow the story with tremendous ease, and enjoy it. There was a kind of a loving passion to this kind of playwriting. And this, to my mind, and again, I always preface, I'm actually coming to the end of it, but I usually preface every talk I ever give and every rehearsal I ever take with the simple phrase, everything I tell you might be wrong. But to my opinion, from what I've experienced in my time in theatre, the root of so much modern comedy, modern farce, modern pain on the stage can be firmly found within the Restoration comedy period. Okay, I'm going to look at some of the questions now. because people are sending in questions at a ferocious rate. Yes, somebody's got a point there. Valerie, wondering if the cruelty or the coarse language that Alan mentions makes these plays hard to bring to the stage today. No, not at all. In fact, there are infinitely cruder and crueler things on the stage today than you will ever find in a Restoration comedy. Some of the things audiences may find inappropriate, and they may find in our modern age of social behavior a little hard to swallow, if you pardon the phrase, but they are nevertheless incredibly funny, and they still work. I mean, they are ferociously successful. Recruiting Officer, for instance, is always being revised. There was a very famous production in the 60s with Robert Stevens and Laurence Olivier. There was a recent production at the National Theatre. I did the play, oh dear God, 30 years ago. I played Brazen in it at the Gate in Dublin. They are very, very actable. They are very, very accessible, and they're very, very entertaining. Has PICT ever done one of Farquhar's plays? Not in my time, but I promise you we will be in the future. I've just answered that one. I'm looking for more questions. I don't see any at the moment, but something may turn up. Yeah, somebody there just saying they've just done Sheridan's The Rivals at Seton Hill, and I will be discussing Sheridan next week. It's slightly later in the time frame than we're discussing at the moment, but Sheridan did have a massive contribution to make, and I will be discussing that. In fact, as we go down this line, you'll see more and more and more influence of the Irish side of things on the English theatre. Are the plays allegorical, given the names? Yeah, probably. There are, yes, The Beau Stratagem by Farquhar. The beau being the young men and their strategy to seduce young women. So the Beau Stratagem sounds like a military term, strategy. I think his time in the army did have a huge effect on the way he entitled these plays. But one of his earlier plays actually has a much more Irish ring to it. It's called Love and a Bottle. And the rakish character within that, who is as much renowned for drinking as he is for lovemaking. Yes, I wouldn't get too heavy about the titles, though. Yes, here's a very interesting one from Frederick. Timberwake Wertenberger paired the play with Our Country's Good. The Recruiting Officer was the first play to be performed in Australia by convicts. Yes, that was the point I made much earlier. Timberlake did it at the Royal Court in London. And one of the actresses in it was one of a friend of mine who worked with me at the Gate. She created there was a book. In fact, there were two books. The Fatal Shore was an account of the arrival and the development of the penal colony. That was turned into a book, the name of which has just gone straight out of my head. And that book, a group of actors with Timberlake Wertenberger sitting in rehearsal, improvised a play that eventually became a production, which was called Our Country's Good. And the term Our Country's Good comes from the sentence that you be transported for life to the colonies for our country's good. One of the things that happened when they got there, one of the ways that they started the original officer in charge of those convicts, that first major sweep of convicts going out there, one of the ways to create a kind of an order and discipline to bring them together was to put on a play. And the play they did was The Recruiting Officer. It was the first play ever presented on the Australian continent. And that is why I have a suspicion, and I can't remember, but there is a theater, the first custom-built theater in America was actually, as far as I know, in Charleston, South Carolina, now currently known as the Dock Street Theater, where I had done several shows at the Spoleto Festival. And I understand that the first show ever presented on the North American continent was in what is now the Dock Street Theater and was The Recruiting Officer. So this play was really incredibly popular. It was considered high entertainment. It would have been, I think it would have been a go-to theatrical event. But also because of the fact that it doesn't deal with aristocrats, it deals with the middle class and with ordinary people. Makes it so much easier, so much more accessible to the broader audience. Why was homosexuality okay to portray in the theater when it was condemned in society? I didn't say it was homosexuality. I said it was men sleeping with men. There was, I think, a much greater openness, especially in English society. It was the Puritan society that condemned everything. And once Charles II came back to the throne, and right through that period at the end of the Stuart and the beginning of the Hanoverian period, because you had a whole list of kings and queens that were completely removed from the society in which they ruled over. Charles II was the son of Charles I. His brother James II took over. He wanted to return everything to Catholicism. England didn't want that, so England and Parliament basically removed him and made his daughter Mary the monarch. But she didn't want to do that without her husband, and her husband was a Dutchman called William, and he governed over an area called Orange, William of Orange. So they threw out her father, and they became the only duarchy, where they were joint king and queen. And of course, there was in Ireland a famous battle where James II tried to take back the throne by invading Ireland, and lost. Her sister eventually became queen, Queen Anne. She died childless, and so the House of Hanover took over, the cousins, the German side. All the way through this period, there was no suppression of homosexuality. It was still technically illegal. I mean, at the time of Henry VIII, he could be executed for it, but it was still technically illegal. But I don't think anybody really bothered about it. It was only when the Victorians came along and established a new morality that really became a problem. You have no overt homosexuality on stage, but you have an awful lot of suggested, and that happened from Shakespeare all the way through. So we got some questions here I'm just going to look at. How are Farquhar and MacDonagh's comedies similar or different? There's a question for you. Well, I'm putting the argument that writers like MacDonagh are following in that linear descent, ascent, whatever you want. That the way MacDonagh writes his comedies, they are cruel, they are about cruelty, and they make cruelty funny. So that he is part of that linear development, that inheritance of a form of writing. Did Farquhar act in his own work, or did he give up after leaving Dublin? Well, Farquhar had an unfortunate life. I mean, he didn't live for a very long time. He was very young when he died. He always had something of a drinking problem. He drank himself to death. He got tricked into marriage by a woman who was older than him and had 3 children already, by convincing him that she was richer than she was. He did well by them. He tried to do well by them, but he basically was one of the classic example of an actor dying in a garret, or an artist dying in a garret, completely drunk and completely broke. A friend of mine in Dublin wrote a play about it. It's a one-man show, and I would love to put it on here, and I will eventually get round to it. With a wonderful restoration title of a cold breeze, no, a cool gale and roast chicken. a gale being a breeze. But it is about Farquhar's last days, and the fact that rather tragically, his final great success as a playwright at Drury Lane was the Beaux Stratagem, and I think within a month of that being first staged, he died, and I don't think he was even 30 at that point, or if he was only just. So I don't think he did a lot of acting in his own plays, no. Were the plays a reaction to Cromwell's Puritanism? Oh my God, yes. I think that's one of the joys of it. When you have a period of repression, when you have a period of suffering, out of it, art will tend to celebrate life. We are now in a Cromwellian suppression. We are not allowed out of our homes. Welcome to my home, by the way. We're not allowed out of our houses. We cannot congregate together. We can't come within sight. We all are desperate for a hug. But none of this is allowed. And this could go on for months. We are going to get more and more isolated, more and more alone. This happens in times of political suppression. It happens in times of medical suppression. It happened at the time of the Spanish flu. The world becomes isolated and alone and depressed. The moment that release happens, art jumps to the fore, and there is a celebration, not of death, not of aloneness, none of that. We celebrate life. It's part of the joys of artists, and anybody tells you that art doesn't matter, they're wrong. Because now that you're all on your own, what are you doing? You're watching movies, you're listening to music, you're reading books, you're doing all of those things. You're playing games, you're acting. Art is how we survive. Art is about who we are. It's about how we celebrate ourselves. So yeah, when the Cromwellian suppression was over, art wanted to represent the joy of being alive. And I think the whole of the Restoration writers celebrated that, the joy of being alive, the joy of the freedom of expression, the right to say what you wanted without fear. So yeah, I think the answer to that is, yay, Cromwell's gone. Did Farquhar achieve commercial success or only post-mortem? Yes, he did. He made money. He didn't make as much as he would have liked, and he did tend to spend it on other people. But he never lived long enough to really benefit. And remember, in this period, a play was a great success if it ran a few weeks. Most of the money would go to the actor man. I mean, Garrick, for instance, the great English writer, the great English actor, David Garrick, would just simply announce. He would have posters put up around London, which was a very much smaller place now, saying Mr. Garrick will give his Richard III on Thursday for 5 performances, and he would make more money relative to today than any of us might make in a year, just for a few performances. Most of the money went to the actors. The writers only got a relatively small share of that. Were they more or well received by Irish or English audiences? I think that I don't know about the Irish audience, to be honest. I don't know the answer to that, but the English audience loved them. So anyway, we've come, my goodness, I've been rabbiting on for an hour. We've come to the end of this. Now, as I said before, if you have any more questions, you want to say anything, you want to send an email, you can do that. We will respond if we get emails from you. This will be available. You'll get an email later about 5 o'clock today telling you how to link into this if you want to look at it again, or if you didn't see it, you can do that. If you have any suggestions, constructive or otherwise, I'd be delighted to hear them. Sorry, just one answer there, Tim. Were the actors considered bigger stars or the writers? Seems the writers were appreciated more. No, it was the actors. Writers never get the full whack. But anyway, that's for, as I say, you can You can email us with any further questions. We will be here same time next week. We're going to be talking about Richard Brinsley Sheridan. I did say that there would be a trivia question. I mentioned something, a particular piece of information about George Farquhar. There was another very famous modern Irish playwright who came from the same place. First email in with the name of that writer will get 2 tickets to our next production, which hopefully will be in the fall. And next week I'll have details about what that play is going to be. I think that's about it. When you do come, if you do look on the email that will definitely come to all of you, and even those of you who aren't actually tuned in will be getting the email as well, you will notice that we are saying to you, PICT needs your support. We are here, we're going to do this, we've got more planned for you. We're going to be doing poetry presentations and various other things. We've got a lot planned for you, but we do still need your support because we don't have any box office at the moment. So anytime that you get something from us that you enjoy, or even that annoys you, you can donate. You can hit the big red button and send us a little something, and believe me, it will be very well received. And that's all I have to say for now, except thank you for being with us. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I see you all again next week when it's Mr. Sheridan. And apart from that, take very good care, mind yourselves, wash your hands, and don't do what I keep doing. That. All right? Thank you all. Goodbye.